here's how to start. So I actually took a 9x12 sheet of paper and taped it down to a board using masking tape. And I'm taping it down to the board because I know I'm going to be using watercolor at some point. So I don't want that paper to move around, and I don't want any buckling or bubbles in the paper. All right, so the first step really is to make little frames. We're actually going to make 2 frames here. Each frame is going to measure 5x7, and I've already cut out a 5x7 card so I can trace it instead of actually measuring it with a ruler. You can just measure the old-fashioned way with a ruler, but I prefer tracing because it's faster. So I am stacking these one on top of the other, and as you can see, this will be a rectangular frame, so that's frame number 1, and here comes frame number 2. If you're working on a little bit smaller paper, it is okay to go with a 4x6 instead, but nothing smaller than a 4x6 inch rectangle. So now we have 2 frames. What's left is coming up with an image that you're going to look at. So we are studying flowers, and we're looking either at a flower, or you could look at plant leaves, I suppose, but it should be a fairly complicated design. And I just numbered them 1 and 2 just to clarify. So I happen to have a book that has a lot of references of flowers in them, so I found some flowers that I connect with. These happen to be a flower called a nasturtium. You can actually eat them, and some people put them in salads, and they have a spicy kind of tang to them. Anyway, that's not why I chose them. I chose them because I'm familiar with them, and I thought it'd be interesting to draw. At first glance, they seem kind of basic, but they're actually much more complicated than just like a daisy, for instance. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the outer shape, and this is a gesture, so that means I'm not concerned with getting it down perfectly. I'm trying to figure out what the positive space looks like. And I am drawing really light. In fact, you're probably having a hard time picking up the image, but I'm just drawing the outer shape and the petals. I should mention that whatever picture you choose, you should have more than one object. So this one happens to have multiple ones, like it has 2, 2.5. And it has some leaves in there too, which I will also be including. And I'm planning on putting watercolor over the top of my drawing, so it is important that I draw fairly light. You don't want to see the pencil marks through the watercolor because watercolor is a transparent medium, which means you can see through it. I'm going to fast forward this a little bit so you can see it in time lapse. Okay, so the point of this part of the drawing is to just get down the positive shapes, to figure out where the spacing is and how each object relates to the other. And like I said, you go pretty light when you're doing this. I'm not going to concern myself too much with perfection and detail at this stage, not right now. That's going to happen in a minute. So I'm just trying to figure out the placement of the shapes and where the positive space is and where those empty negative spaces occur. Okay, so here's what it looks like. It's pretty abstract, right? I mean, that could be popcorn. It could be anything. It's very abstract. Now I'm going to go in just a moment and make sure I detail it so it makes sense. This is going to be like a visual map for me to follow when I go in and start introducing colors. So here is where I will begin to lay in the details. Let me go ahead and post into the video the image that I'm using, the reference picture, so you can see kind of what I'm drawing at the same time as I'm drawing it. And I'm actually starting at one point, so I'm starting off with one petal first, and I'm going to detail that petal and move from one petal to the next to the next. So that way I don't get lost. I can have an order in my mind that will, to me, make sense. And when you're drawing stuff, it's true you don't necessarily have to draw everything, but I am including the veins on the flower. This flower has some crimson colored veins, and there is a pattern there that you have to follow. So I am trying to be faithful to that. And I'll draw spots, I'll draw little creases on there, I'll draw where there's a little flap that's folded over. So I am going to be specific there. I'm still going to be conscious of going pretty light. I don't want to go too dark, although you can see I'm pressing a little bit harder than before. And this is almost like putting together a puzzle piece. Each petal interlocks with the next petal, and you kind of have to see it that way. And you really need to look frequently at your reference picture. You can also do this live. In fact, for the next one, I am going to be looking at some real life flowers, although they're artificial. So artificial flowers, but I'm looking at them in real life and I'm transferring that onto my paper. So you don't necessarily have to use a printed out picture. One thing that I was going to recommend to you is that if you have any garden catalogs, there are some really beautiful pictures of flowers or plants that would make a really interesting drawing. And you can also kind of zoom in on an area, like my picture is zoomed in. It's not the whole plant. It's just a couple of the flowers. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, like I said, a flowering plant. It could be something else. It could be some kale. It could be a different object. You're going to find, though, that plants are more forgiving than drawing people. But that being said, there's a lot to look at, and the colors can sometimes be distracting, so you have to focus on each individual piece of whatever you're working on. And I usually ignore the rest when I'm working on that one piece. And when I get confused, I look at it in terms of negative space or shapes. And this flower has like an interesting centerpiece. So I am just trying to look at that and copy it as faithfully as I can. And I'd say don't pick something that's too easy. Challenge yourself. And there's a lot of great plants out there. You could do a succulent too. That's fine with me. But it should be moderately complex, not too basic. So right there, I'm drawing a lot of negative space, and then there's some funky textures going on here. You will want to include some texture on your work. This plant has some interesting leaves. They almost look like lily pads. They're almost perfectly round, and their stem is right in the center. If you pick one, it looks like a miniature umbrella. And the flowers come in these different shades of yellow and orange and red with a yellow throat. And like I said, you can eat them. They look really pretty in salads. And it is okay to have things going off page. I actually think it can be interesting having something go off paper, so I'm letting mine go all the way to the edge of the frame. You can kind of see the difference there between the drawing on the left, which has more information, and that blob on the right. You do kind of want to think about your focal point. Where is your focal point? What's the most important part? And I start with my focal point usually, so that flower on the left, that's going to be my focal point. The other flower, it's a little bit more it's a little bit more smushed and you don't see it as much. Like it's almost like you're not seeing the full flower. So I'm going to make that more of like a secondary focal. But I still want to give it some information. So I want to give it those veins, and I want to articulate the outer edge. And you can see I'm erasing stuff as I go because I'm correcting. I don't usually get things perfect the first time out. I make little adjustments. And on those veins, if I don't get them perfect, that's okay too, because I'm going back in with paint and with a brush. You may need a skinny brush for this, I'm thinking. So we are working on just the outline today, and it's just the first outline. We'll do the second one for the next in-person class. And then I'm going to check them. But again, don't go too dark. Go pale-ish. Part of the beauty of watercolor is that it's very bright and jewel-like, and that transparency that we were talking about, that transparent quality. I don't think there's any other medium that has that kind of degree of transparency. So your job is to put detail on the whole thing, but especially on the areas of high importance. So the flowers, and then I put some veins on the leaves, but I don't have to be as specific as correct on those. And you want to think about how the human eye perceives stuff. When we look at something, we can only see one thing in focus at a time, and everything else gets more hazy and out of focus the farther away it is. So I'm going to let my background and those leaves be a little bit out of focus, a little bit abstract, which is fun. You can play with that. Those are some stems that were sticking up in between the flowers, so I'm going to include that. So I am just about done for this lesson, and here's what it looks like in its entirety, and I would call that done for today.